also, you were emphasizing the focus that needed to be made and still needs to be made today on the working class. And I'm glad that you highlighted that. I think that's very important. And these lessons that we're talking about, though, they don't just apply to Russia, during that time. You mentioned even in current times, Myanmar, for example, but, 100 or so years ago, we saw China go through a revolution. And yeah, although that was a failed revolution, a lot of the theory and lessons can be applied to what happened there. And the question of the Chinese Revolution, I think, is actually coming around a lot with young people in particular, asking about, what happened there. So can you explain, what were the mistakes that were made in the Chinese Revolution?
Well, yes. I mean, as you say, the lessons from the permanent revolution are extremely relevant today. We used them in the intervention that we had in Belarus. In Myanmar, the issues come up. In a whole number of other countries, these issues are coming up time after time after time. But as you say, the issue of the Chinese Revolution, the revolutionary events in China in 25 to 27, they were a tragedy, because if there had been a victory for the Chinese Revolution then, it would have changed the world in many, many ways. First of all, it would have stopped the Stalinist degeneration in Russia itself. It would have put a block on that. It would have inspired revolution in other countries. We could have been talking about a global revolution. But of course that didn't happen. And we have to understand why, so that we don't make the same mistakes. And I think the first thing to point out is when the events started, I think it was in in the middle of 1925, you already had the death of Lenin. Trotsky was being eased out of influence within the Bolshevik Party. I wouldn't say that the whole process had been carried through to the end, but the process had started and so on. And that the Chinese Communist Party, which at one time had been quite a powerful force, it even had, I think, at the beginning of the 20s, something like 60,000 members. It was a significant force, even in a big country. But unfortunately, it was being advised and pressured by the Comintern, the Communist International, which had already started a process of Stalinist degeneration alongside the Stalinist degeneration that had started within the Russian Revolution itself. And the argument was, at least the Stalinists said, that China is a backward country. It was a former imperialist colony, which had been very hard hit by imperialism, particularly the British imperialists with their gunboat diplomacy and their opium wars. It was a largely peasant country, they argued, but then so was Russia. And in China, you had seen the development very quickly of a relatively small in numbers, but a very militant working class that was beginning to play the same role that was played by the Russian working class in the period before the Russian Revolution. You had a whole period of student and worker protests. And then in the middle of June 1925, British and French machine gunners shot down dozens of strikers. And by doing so, they provoked a 14-month-long uprising in Canton. The result of the uprising was imperialism was paralysed. The workers had elements of workers' control over society. For example, they shut down the opium dens, they shut down the gambling joints, they set up an improvised Soviet, or something that was very similar to the Russian Soviets. But the Communist Party, that in Russia would have been stepped into the Soviets and used the Soviet to lead the revolution, the Chinese Communist Party, under the influence of the Stalinists, had a different position. They went back to the position. They said that the Communist Party should support the Kuomintang, which was the bourgeois nationalists, quite a reactionary party led by Chiang Kai-shek. The Communist Party argued that the task in China was to establish a bloc of four classes: the workers, the national capitalists, the peasantry, and the urban petty bourgeois. I suppose it's what you could call Menchevism with Chinese characteristics, if you want to be a bit flippant about it. The communists were told to join the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang was asked to join the Comintern. Stalin praised the revolutionary Kuomintang and its revolutionary leadership. But behind this deception, the counter-revolution was raising its head. Gradually, the Kuomintang was moving to crush the workers' movement. And in March 26, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, banned workers' organizations, executed 300 communists, and established a military dictatorship across Canton. In other words, he beheaded the revolution because of the Menshevik class collaborationist tactics and strategy of the Chinese Communist Party under the influence of the Stalinized Comintern. And of course, what happened later was maybe added further tragedy to the whole story, because the need for revolutionary change never died. But the national bourgeois was never strong enough to carry out their own revolution in China. So that after the Second World War, when the Kuomintang was weakened by the defeats of the war and so on, Mao was able to lead his Red Army. He redistributed land, it is true, on the way to take over the country. But when he took it over, he established a Stalinist-style one-party dictatorship. And, of course, with time we know that although there were elements of planning in China, that it's now re-established capitalism. It's become an imperialist power. And in a number of countries in that part of the world, people are getting very, very angry at the so-called communists in China who are acting against the interests of the working class. And the Stalinists never learnt any lessons from this catastrophe. They continued to subjugate the workers' struggle to that of the bourgeoisie. They did it in Spain and betrayed the Spanish Revolution. They did it in France. They did it in a whole number of other countries. They did it in Chile in 1973 and so on. And it's led to a whole number of catastrophes to the working class over the ages.